People say it all the time. Weather rules all when you're cruising. But what exactly does that mean? Hi, I'm Nika Waters, and welcome to the Boat Galley Podcast. Today I'm talking about 3 weather lessons that we had to relearn kind of the hard way as we set off on our shakedown cruise. Today's episode of the Boat Galley Podcast is sponsored by fastseas.com. That's FASTSEAS.com. Budget-friendly weather routing and passage planning for cruisers by a cruiser. Plan your next passage using fastseas.com. Whether you're after speed or comfort, FastSeas will find the optimum route to your destination. Use coupon code BG20 for an exclusive 10% discount. FastSeas, making weather routing simple. Well, the first thing with weather is, of course, paying attention to it. But there were a few things and few nuances that we'd forgotten about that we had to relearn a little bit the hard way when we set off on our shakedown cruise a little bit earlier this summer. We had sort of set Maine as our goal for the summer season, and we really got going a little bit later than we wanted to. We wanted to get north fast. So we left Cape May on a weather window that we thought looked okay. But here are some lessons that we learned when we wound up having to duck into Atlantic City because it wasn't exactly great weather. Lesson number 1. Looking at the long-term forecast picture and understanding your boat and how it behaves is a great place to start. We initially were leaving from Deltaville, and we thought, okay, we can slide out the bottom of the Chesapeake Bay and go offshore immediately to the Cape Cod Canal. And that would have required a 3 to 4 day weather window, and not including the day that it would take us to get down to Cape Charles. And knowing that and understanding that as we're looking at weather forecasts and getting a bigger idea of what the weather does in general, we didn't have that kind of a forecast. And so we decided that we were going to go north through the Chesapeake Bay, through the Chesapeake, Delaware, the C&D Canal, and then down the Delaware Bay to Cape May. It would give us a chance to wait at Cape May for the right window to go north. It shaved about 60, 70 miles off the offshore leg, that's about 10 hours for us. It did add a couple of days to the transit in between, but those were days that we could just go kind of day hops if we wanted to. Lesson number 2, have contingency plans always at the ready. So after our idea of going offshore from the mouth of the Chesapeake all the way up to Cape Cod was scrapped, we thought, okay, we'll go overnight up the bay. But then we started looking at radar. Not radar, we don't have radar on the boat, but we still have reasonable access to internet. And so we could just look at the weather radar like you would at a house or something like that. And it showed an intense band of convection marching its way from Pennsylvania over to the Atlantic coast. This was August in the Chesapeake when thunderstorms come up in the afternoon on a fairly regular basis, and thunderstorms often bring with them crazy winds and sharp seas. And it's really not great to be out in open water. Well, we prefer not to be out in open water in thunderstorms. Other people may feel differently. We knew that we could duck out at Solomon's, which has an entrance and an anchorage that we're familiar with, and we just decided, you know what, it's a no-brainer. We're just going to do that. And the following night, we saw similar radar pictures. We got some great advice on bailout points because we were in a part of the Chesapeake that we're much less familiar with from our friend Dave. Lesson number 3. This is a biggie. Don't try to push the forecast. What I mean by this is that you might see a forecast that says south winds 5 to 10 knots starting Friday night. And then Saturday, it turns to northeast late. And you may say, oh, okay, that's going to mean that it's turning south early and it's going to go northeast really late. We had been sitting in Cape May for a couple of days. We were bounced around by wakes. We were watching people and worrying about how they were anchoring in the not particularly great holding in the Cape May anchorage. We had taken advantage of being in a town that had a laundromat. We'd done laundry and we were ready to go north. It was time to get north. And the winds were pretty consistently northeast to east, which was kind of a bummer because the week before they'd been kind of south the whole time. South. They were sitting at northeast to east. and we needed at least southeast winds to be able to sail And we much prefer to sail, plus we can go faster, it's much more comfortable, all of those kinds of things. So the forecast for Monday afternoon and evening was east-southeast, note the east-southeast, becoming southeast after midnight. And we thought it might be okay. Well, this is where my feeling came into play in a not great way. And I don't particularly like leaving at dusk. If we're going into an overnight passage, I would much prefer to get moving during daylight, because I like to get myself oriented being at sea when I can see clearly, get used to the motion of the boat and the waves, and all the rest of it. And if we were going to wait until the next morning, it felt like a waste of another night in an anchorage that we weren't too excited about. Well, if we could go at 8 o'clock, why not leave at 2 o'clock? We looked at the anchorage and where we were in Cape May, and the winds were already easterly, which meant they were going to start shifting southeast early. It was going to be great. But we'd had lots of days of easterly winds, and there was a huge easterly swell. The coast of New Jersey is pretty shallow. I don't think we saw much deeper than about 40 or 45 feet, and there was a steep cross chop between the winds and the swell that was going in. And that wind was stubbornly easterly. It was maybe a smidge south of east, and it wasn't 5 to 10 knots. It was 15 to 20, and it was raining. And we'd forgotten sort of to check that radar. This is a little bit of a lesson number 4. Check the radar offshore before you leave an anchorage. We had squall activity that sort of was sitting on top of us and actually wound up chasing us and hovering over us like Pigpen's cloud of dust all the way up to Atlantic City. It was an extraordinarily rough passage. And by about 8 p.m., we left at about 2, we'd set a new waypoint for Atlantic City because remember lesson 2, contingency plans? Jeremy had been hand steering the whole way. I'd spelled him for about 20 minutes, giving him time to eat dinner, read about the inlet that we were going to go into that we'd never been in before, and I had no idea how he kept going. The seas were just terrible. They were worse than any of our Gulf Stream passages. The boat was being tossed about by the waves, crashing down, slewing sideways as it was caught by a cross swell. The winds might have been veering to the southeast, although I don't even think they did, but it was definitely not sailable, not by any stretch of the imagination. And even though that Atlantic City anchorage was rolly as all get out, when we finally put the hook down and it caught at midnight, it felt like we could breathe a little bit. And then when we woke up in the morning, we checked the forecast and we read buoys and listened to a couple boats on the VHF confirming that the seas and winds were down from what we'd seen the night before. Our sail was actually delightful. The sun was out, the autopilot was steering, we didn't have to have on serious foul weather gear, and the boat was having a field day in much gentler swells with a lot less cross chop. The weather window, though, that long-term weather window, was closing fast. And we decided that we were either going to go into New York City, but we were enjoying ourselves so much we kept going and headed for Block Island. We could have kept going to the Cape Cod Canal. That would have been, again, about another 70 miles, and we just didn't want to take those 10 hours. If we had waited until 8 p.m., when the original thought was to leave, would we have had a better trip? Possibly. I don't know. Is it that we needed to wait until at least midnight to go? What did we do wrong? Well, one of the big things that we did wrong, and this was more my fault, and all of these actually were mine. This is not Jeremy. This is me. 1, we looked for what we wanted to see in the forecast. Instead of seeing it as east-southeast, we saw it as east-southeast, southeast. I didn't want to leave at dark. And I was in a hurry to leave. I was like, come on, let's go. Let's get up there. And what we should have done was we should have corroborated the forecast with actual conditions. If they were calling for it to be east veering southeasterly, we should have waited for it to go southeasterly before we picked up the hook. We could have contacted boats that were underway. One of the things that's great about AIS is being able to see boats that are already out there. And we could have either listened in on conversations like we did the next morning, or even called a boat by name and asked them what the actual conditions were like out there. And really, forget this being reluctant to leave it dark. We should have left right after dinner, or even in the morning, if the conditions had warranted. But the big lesson learned, don't push the forecast. Really. My friend Bian keeps saying that misery is optional, and that's one of the reasons that we ducked into Atlantic City was we were already pretty miserable. We didn't need to keep being miserable. Misery is optional. Paying good attention to the weather can help make it absolutely that way. I can't wait to share an Anchorage with you when we've all gotten over any weather mistakes that we've made and we're there together. Thank you so much for listening to the Boat Galley podcast. If you're going to be at the Annapolis Boat Show, Carolyn and I would love to see you. There's a Boat Galley booth, M5 and M6, right next to the gin barge, in between the gin barge and the VIP tent. We're pretty hard to miss. Carolyn will be there most of the time, and I'll be there every day from 4 to 6. Have the most spectacular week.